The rust-eaten gate screamed like a dying man when Jake Carter forced it open. It was a sound he knew too well. He'd spent 6 years listening to men die, and now, in the silence of his self-imposed exile, even the Montana wind, whispering through the shattered panes of his family's derelict farmhouse, sounded like a final, rattling breath. This was his graveyard, a 10-acre plot of weeds and memories, and he was its sole, resident ghost. Jake was a man built of spare parts and scar tissue, a former Marine raider medically discharged after his skeleton had been rearranged by a daisy-chained IED in Helmand Province. The blast had taken his fire team. It had taken his career. It had scooped out his soul and left a hollow space where a man used to be. Every morning he woke to the phantom smell of scorched earth and ozone, the ghosts of his brothers standing silent watch at the foot of his bed. There was Ramirez, grinning his stupid, infectious grin. There was Kowalski, the immovable giant. And there was Sergeant Mike Sullivan, Sully, his best friend, his brother in all but blood. Sully had been a handler. His partner, a magnificent German Shepherd military working dog named Athena, had been the tip of their spear. She was fury and loyalty wrapped in black and tan fur, a four-legged operator who had saved their lives more times than Jake could count. The IED had taken her too. Jake remembered the deafening roar, the world turning into a storm of fire and shrapnel, and then the awful ringing silence that followed. He'd woken up in Landstuhl, Germany, a jigsaw puzzle of broken bones and seared flesh. They told him he was the only survivor. A miracle, the doctors had called it. A curse. Jake knew it to be. Now his days were a monotonous loop of survival. He'd patch the leaking roof, chop wood until his rebuilt shoulder screamed in protest, and stare at the bottle of whiskey on the counter, fighting a war that had no clear objective and no hope of victory. He was haunted, not by what he had done, but by what he had failed to do. He had survived. It was an unforgivable sin. The isolation was a kind of armor, protecting the world from the broken thing he had become. He spoke to no one. He saw no one. The farm was his fortress, and his memories were the enemy laying siege, but even ghosts needed supplies. The last of the canned beans had been eaten 2 days ago, and the biting November wind was a stark reminder that winter was a predator preparing its ambush. With a sigh that felt like it dredged up mud from the bottom of his soul, he climbed into his battered Ford pickup, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan. The drive into the small, forgotten town of Prairie Creek was a journey through a world he no longer belonged to. People laughed in cafes, children played in yards. Life moved on with an indifference that felt like a personal insult. He was a black and white photograph in a world of vibrant color, a relic of a war everyone else was trying to forget. He parked in front of the feed store, the only place he ever went. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement, a habit learned in places where looking someone in the eye could get you killed. He just needed flour, salt, and coffee. In and out. No contact. Maintain the perimeter. But as he reached for the door handle, a sound cut through the low hum of the town. A snarling, guttural growl, followed by a man's sharp, cruel laugh. Jake's head snapped up. Across the street, in front of a dingy tavern with a flickering neon sign, an old man was struggling with a leash of a large German shepherd. The dog was a maelstrom of desperate energy, lunging and snapping, its body a taut wire of fear and aggression. It was painfully thin, its ribs starkly visible beneath a coat of matted fur. Scars, pale and silver, traced patterns across its muzzle and flank. Leaning against a pickup truck, a greasy pot-bellied man in a stained trucker hat was enjoying the spectacle. This was Kale. Everyone in town knew Kale. He was a low-grade infection, a bully who preyed on the weak because he was terrified of the strong. "Looks like you got more than you can handle there, Peterson," Kale sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the old man's feet. "That thing's a menace. You ought to sell him to me. I could put that meanness to good use." The old man, Mr. Peterson stumbled, his face pale with exertion. "She's not for sale, Kale. Now leave us be." "She?" Kale laughed again, a wet, unpleasant sound. "A bitch in more ways than one, huh?" Come on, old timer, 500 bucks. I'll take the monster off your hands. Jake watched, his hand frozen on the door handle. His mantra, his only rule, was to not get involved. The civilian world had its own wars, and they weren't his to fight. He was retired, broken, done. He started to turn away, to retreat back into the gray fog of his existence. But then he saw the dog's eyes. As she twisted against the leash, her gaze locked with his for a fraction of a second. In their depths, he saw it, the same hollowed-out, haunted look he saw in his own reflection every morning. It wasn't malice in her eyes, it was the abyss. It was the look of a soldier who had seen too much, lost too much, and was now trapped on a battlefield she couldn't escape. Something inside him, a tectonic plate of grief and duty that had been dormant for years, shifted. The ghosts of his team whispered in his ear. Sully's voice, clear as day. You don't leave a brother behind. Ever. He let go of the door handle. His feet moved before his brain gave the order, carrying him across the asphalt with a purpose he hadn't felt since he'd last worn a uniform. The world sharpened. The sounds of the town faded into a dull roar, and his focus narrowed to the man in the stained hat. Cale was still laughing, reaching out as if to grab the leash from the old man's trembling hand. I said. Jake's voice was a low growl, the sound of gravel grinding under a tank tread. Leave him be. Cale turned, his sneer faltering as he took in the man standing before him. Jake wasn't large in the way a brawler was. He was lean, coiled, every line of his body radiating a lethal stillness. The scars on his face and neck were a roadmap of violence, and his eyes were flat, cold, and empty. They were the eyes of a man who had already died and had nothing left to lose. Who the hell are you? Cale blustered, trying to regain his footing. This ain't none of your business, Ghost. Jake didn't respond. He simply took one more step forward, closing the distance. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't change his expression. He just looked at Cale, and in that look, Cale saw a promise. It wasn't a promise of a black eye or a broken nose. It was a promise of swift, merciless, and total annihilation. It was the look a predator gives its prey just before the final strike. Jake's training had taught him that the most effective weapon was often the threat of violence, not the act itself. He became the monster so others wouldn't have to. Cale's bravado crumbled into dust. He saw that he wasn't dealing with a farmer or a local. He was dealing with something else entirely, something that had been forged in a place of fire and death. He took a half step back, then another. The fear was a pungent scent in the air. Whatever, man. Dogs probably rabid anyway. He spat on the ground one last time, a pathetic attempt to salvage some shred of his pride, before scurrying to his truck and peeling out of the parking lot. Silence descended. The dog, sensing the shift in energy, had stopped struggling. She stood panting, her gaze now fixed entirely on Jake. Mister. Peterson leaned against a light pole, catching his breath, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude. He was a small, frail man, his face a testament to a long, hard life. Thank you, he said, his voice thin and reedy. He looked from Jake to the dog, a deep sadness in his eyes. She's a lot to handle, more than I was prepared for. He took a step towards Jake, his movements slow and deliberate. He studied Jake's face, his posture, the way he held himself. It was a look of profound recognition. You've served, Mr. Peterson stated. It wasn't a question. Jake gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The old man's gaze softened. My son did too. Army. He didn't make it back. He looked down at the dog, his hand stroking her head. The animal didn't flinch from his touch, but she remained tense, watchful. She was his. He sent her to me, said she'd need a quiet place. But she's not a quiet dog. She's waiting, pacing. She needs a soldier, not an old man. He held out the worn, leathered leash. The dog at the end of it whined softly, a low, mournful sound. She was still staring at Jake, her head cocked, her ears perked. There was an unnerving intelligence in her gaze, a flicker of something ancient and knowing. Take her, Mr. Peterson said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Please. I can't give her what she needs. A warrior needs a pack. He pushed the leash into Jake's unresisting hand. A strange warmth, a current of energy seemed to pass between them. She already knows you, the old man whispered. Jake looked down at the dog, then back at the old man, bewildered. He'd never seen this man or this dog in his life. But as his fingers closed around the leash, the German shepherd took a tentative step towards him. She stopped her panting, went completely still, and nudged his hand with her cold, wet nose. It wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a report for duty. Jake led the dog to his truck, a sense of profound unease settling over him. He had broken his one rule. He had gotten involved. He had inherited a problem, a responsibility he didn't want. He opened the passenger door, and the dog, without any command, leaped onto the bench seat, turned in a tight circle, and lay down, her eyes never leaving his. He didn't know her name. Mr. Peterson had just called her she. For now, that was enough. The drive back to the farm was silent, the only sound the rhythmic click of the dog's nails on the dashboard as she shifted her weight. Jake could feel her stare, a constant, probing pressure. It was the look of a trained observer, an asset gathering intelligence. It was deeply unsettling. He had rescued a dog, but he had the distinct feeling he had just walked into a minefield. Back at the farmhouse, he let her out of the truck. She didn't run. She moved with a slow, deliberate economy, sweeping the perimeter of the yard, her nose to the ground. She was clearing the area, checking for threats. It was the exact same pattern Sully had taught Athena to run every time they entered a new compound. A cold dread trickled down Jake's spine. It had to be a coincidence, a common training technique. He brought her inside, into the dusty, neglected house. She ignored the bowl of water he set down and instead conducted a methodical, room-by-room search, her movements fluid and silent. She was a professional. This was no ordinary stray. He knelt down, speaking to her in a low, calm voice. "Easy, girl. You're safe here." He reached out slowly, his hand open. She watched his approach, her body tense, but she didn't growl. As his fingers brushed the fur on her neck, he felt it, a small, hard lump beneath the skin, not a tumor, something manufactured, something familiar. Later, as she finally slept, an exhausted, twitching sleep on a pile of old blankets, he examined her more closely. In the dim light of a kerosene lamp, he found what he was looking for. Tucked away in the fine fur of her left ear was a faded tattoo, the lines blurred with age and scar tissue. It was a series of numbers and letters, an ID code, a military designation. His blood ran cold. This was a military working dog, an MWD who was somehow in the possession of an old man in the middle of nowhere. Stolen, lost, retired. He had to know more. He had to know who she was. The next morning, he drove her to the only vet in the county, a small clinic run by a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris was sharp, no nonsense, and had a reputation for being fiercely protective of animals. When she saw Jake, a scarred and grim-faced man, with the equally scarred and wary dog, her expression became guarded. "Found her, did you?" she asked, her tone skeptical as she led them into an examination room. "Something like that," Jake grunted. "Can you scan her for a chip and check out this tattoo?" Eris ran the scanner over the dog's back and shoulders. It beeped. "Well, she's got one," she said, her eyes on the computer monitor, her brow furrowed. "That's odd. It's not registering with any of the civilian databases. It's encrypted." She leaned closer to the screen. "The prefix is DOD, Department of Defense. This is military hardware." She looked from the screen to Jake, her professional caution warring with a rising sense of alarm. "This dog is government property. Where did you say you got her?" "I didn't," Jake said, his voice flat. He pointed to the tattoo in the dog's ear. "What about this?" Eris carefully cleaned the area and read the faded numbers aloud. As she typed them into a separate search field on a secure veterinary network, Jake's gut twisted into a tight, cold knot. He knew what was happening. He was crossing a line, a point of no return. He was inviting the world he had fought so hard to escape right back to his doorstep. The database returned a single, heavily redacted file. Most of the information was classified, but two words were starkly, horribly clear. Designation, MWD Athena. Status, KIA. Eris Thorne looked up from the monitor, her face pale. This can't be right. According to this file, this dog, this dog died in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Jake felt the floor drop out from under him. The air in the small room became thin, unbreathable. He stared at the dog, who stared back at him with those same knowing eyes. Athena. It was impossible. He had seen the after-action report. He had grieved for her, for Sully, for all of them. Yet here she was, a ghost made of flesh and blood, a living, breathing contradiction that threatened to shatter the fragile peace he had built on a foundation of lies and forgetting. What does this mean? Eris asked, her voice a whisper. It means we're in trouble, Jake said, his mind racing, years of tactical assessment clicking back into place. A dog listed as KIA was back. She was in the hands of a civilian. She had a non-standard encrypted microchip. This wasn't a lost dog. This was a secret, a loose end. And someone, somewhere, would be coming to tie it off. His sanctuary was about to become a war zone. Back at the farm, the silence was no longer a comfort. It was a threat. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old house, was a potential enemy contact. Jake moved with a renewed, grim purpose. He wasn't the ghost of a broken man anymore. He was an operator. He cleaned his service pistol, a Sig Sauer P226 he wasn't technically supposed to have, the familiar weight of cold comfort in his hand. He checked the sight lines from the windows, mapped out fields of fire, and noted the weak points of the house's perimeter. The dog, Athena, shadowed his every move. She was no longer just a dog in his eyes. She was a soldier, a member of his team, the last member. He watched her, and he saw the training Sully had so painstakingly instilled in her. She moved with a quiet efficiency, always positioning herself in a place of tactical advantage, usually between him and the most likely point of entry. She wasn't just watching him, she was guarding him. The call came in the dead of night. Jake didn't know how they found him. Maybe the bully, Kale, had been more than just a local thug. Maybe he was a spotter, a low-level cog in a much larger machine. Or maybe the chip in Athena's neck was more than just an ID tag. Maybe it was a beacon. It didn't matter. The enemy was at the gate. The first sign was a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Athena let out a low, almost inaudible growl, the fur on her back standing rigid. Jake was already moving, pistol in hand, cutting the lights, and pulling Eris, who had insisted on staying after what they'd discovered, down behind an overturned oak table. He had called her clinic, a terse warning. They're coming for the dog. They'll start with you. Get over here, now. She had arrived minutes ago, her car hidden in the dilapidated barn. A professionally quiet sound broke the stillness, the crunch of gravel under a combat boot. Then another. They were disciplined. At least 2, probably 3. They were spreading out, flanking the house. Amateurs would have rushed the front door. These men were professionals. The first round shattered the kitchen window, the crack of the suppressed rifle sounding like a distant sniper shot. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a probe, designed to make them panic, to make them move. Jake didn't move. He held his position, his breathing slow and even, the world narrowing to the front sight of his pistol. Stay down, he whispered to Eris, whose own breathing was ragged with terror. A second shadow darted across the porch. Jake tracked it, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The P226 barked, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A grunt, a heavy thud, and the shadow was gone. Contact front. 1 down. Suddenly the back door splintered, kicked in with explosive force. A figure clad in black tactical gear, armed with a short-barreled rifle, stormed in. Jake was already turning, bringing his weapon to bear, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The man had the drop on him, but he hadn't accounted for the dog. With a roar that was pure, concentrated fury, Athena launched herself from the shadows. She was not a pet. She was a weapon. She hit the attacker in the chest like a fur-covered missile, all teeth and claws, and 70 pounds of righteous rage. The man screamed, his rifle discharging into the ceiling as they crashed to the floor. He tried to bring the weapon around, to push her off, but she was a whirlwind of controlled violence, her jaws locking onto his arm. The momentary distraction was all Jake needed. He fired twice, 2 tight, controlled shots to the center mass. The second attacker crumpled, his fight over. But there was a third, a voice from the darkness of the front yard. "Stand down, Marine. Give us the asset, and you get to live." Jake dragged a heavy bookshelf in front of the broken door, creating a makeshift barricade. Athena stood beside him, a low growl rumbling in her chest, blood dripping from her muzzle. It wasn't hers. "Who are you?" Jake yelled back, reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency. "We're the people you don't say no to," the voice replied, cold and devoid of emotion. "That MWD is proprietary technology, a corporate asset. You are in possession of stolen property worth millions. This does not have to end badly for you. Corporate, not military. This was something else. This, something dirtier." "She's not property," Jake shouted, his voice raw. "She's a soldier." The only answer was a hail of automatic gunfire that tore through the thin walls of the farmhouse, splintering wood and shattering what little glass was left. Jake and Eris hit the floor, wood chips and plaster raining down on them. Athena didn't flinch. She stood her ground, barking defiantly into the storm of bullets. In that moment, Jake saw in her the same insane courage he had seen in the best Marines he had ever known. The courage to stand and fight when every instinct screamed to run. She was one of them. She was one of him. He knew they couldn't hold out for long. The house was a tinderbox, and the men outside had superior firepower. He had one clip left in a house full of angles that worked against him. This was a losing fight. He needed an equalizer. He needed help. There was only one call he could make. Scrabbling for his phone, he shielded it with his body and dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. A number he had memorized like a prayer. It rang twice. "Rostova," a crisp female voice answered. "Colonel, it's Carter," he said. His voice strained over the sound of another burst of gunfire. There was a pause. "Sergeant Carter, I was told you were out of touch." "I have a situation, ma'am. Contact, multiple hostiles, my location. They're after a military asset." He relayed Athena's ID number from memory. "They're calling her corporate property. Designation Athena. Ring any bells?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, profound. When Colonel Eva Rostova finally spoke, her voice had lost its professional detachment. It was laced with a cold, dangerous fury. "Where are you, Sergeant?" He gave her the coordinates of the farm. "Hold your ground, Marine," she commanded, her voice steel. "I'm spinning up a QRF. The cavalry is coming." The line went dead. Jake looked at Athena, who was now licking a shallow graze on his arm. He had made the call. He had brought the storm down on his own head. But looking at the dog, at the unwavering loyalty in her eyes, he knew he would do it again without a moment's hesitation. He had lost one team. He would not lose another. As the firefight outside lulled, the attackers regrouping for a final push, another sound reached them. The rumble of an old truck engine. Headlights cut through the darkness, pulling up the long driveway. It was Mr. Peterson. The old man got out of his truck, his hands raised, his face a mask of terror and resolve. "Stop," he yelled, his voice frail against the tense silence. "Leave them alone." The leader of the contractors stepped out of the shadows, his rifle trained on the old man. "You've made a mistake getting involved, old man." "You don't understand," Peterson pleaded. Jake could hear him through the bullet-riddled wall. "My son, he worked for you, for Cerberus Tactical. He was a bio-researcher." Cerberus. A notoriously shadowy defense contractor. "He saw what you were doing to her." Peterson's voice cracked. "After she was wounded in the blast, you didn't decommission her. You took her. You used her for your experiments, genetic augmentation, neural implants. You tried to turn a hero into a monster, a weapon you could own, but you failed." The pieces clicked into place in Jake's mind. The encrypted chip, her survival, her enhanced abilities. Athena wasn't just a survivor of the IED, she was a prisoner of war. "My son couldn't stand it," Peterson continued, tears streaming down his face. "He smuggled her out. He brought her to me. He said to find a real soldier, someone who would understand, someone who could protect her. He was killed a month later, a hit and run. But it was no accident, was it?" The Cerberus operator just laughed, a cold, empty sound. He was a loose end, and so were you. Before he could raise his rifle, a new sound split the night. Not the crack of a rifle, but the thumping, percussive beat of helicopter rotors. Two sets of them. Within seconds, two Black Hawk helicopters were descending on the farm, their searchlights turning the battlefield as bright as day. Ropes dropped, and a team of heavily armed Marines, in full combat gear, fast roped to the ground, securing the perimeter with terrifying efficiency. The Cerberus contractor stared in disbelief, caught in the brilliant white light. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands. It was over. Colonel Rostova was the first one through the door. She was exactly as Jake remembered, imposing, sharp, with eyes that could cut steel. She took in the scene, the bullet holes, the dead contractors, Jake leaning wounded against the wall, Iris huddled on the floor, and the German shepherd standing guard over them all. Her gaze fell on the dog. "Athena," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. The dog looked at her, whined once, then walked over and nudged her hand. Rostova turned to Jake, her expression a mixture of relief and grim respect. "The report said she was vaporized in the blast. Sully's last transmission was that he was shielding her with his own body. It seems he succeeded." She knelt down, running a hand over Athena's head. "Cerberus falsified the records. They've been running an illegal bioweapons program using decorated MWDs. My office has been building a case against them for a year. Your call, Sergeant, just gave us the star witness and blew the whole thing wide open." Jake finally let the exhaustion wash over him. He slid down the wall, the adrenaline fading, leaving only a deep, throbbing pain in his arm and a profound sense of release. He looked at Athena, this impossible ghost from his past. She was the last living piece of his team, the last echo of his friend, Sully. Saving her wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about honoring the dead. It was about finishing the mission. It was about bringing a soldier home. He hadn't failed after all. 1 year later, the farm was no longer a graveyard. It was a sanctuary. The shattered windows were replaced, the bullet holes patched and painted over. A neat vegetable garden grew where weeds had once choked the life from the soil. The screaming gate had been oiled. It now opened with a quiet swing. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer standing in judgment. They were at peace. Jake Carter was no longer a ghost either. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet calm. The scars remained, a permanent reminder of the man he had been, but they no longer defined the man he was becoming. He was building something new, not just with wood and nails, but with purpose. He and Eris, with funding secured by a grateful Colonel Rostova and a generous donation from Mr. Peterson, had started a nonprofit, the Sully Athena Foundation. They rescued retired or wounded military working dogs, animals deemed too broken or aggressive for civilian life, and gave them a place to heal. The farm was now home to a small pack of heroes: a Belgian Malinois who had lost a leg to a landmine, a Dutch shepherd with severe PTSD, and a black Labrador who had saved a dozen soldiers from IEDs before his nerves gave out. They were a pack of broken warriors, two-legged and four, all healing together. Jake found he had a unique connection with them. He understood their triggers, their nightmares, their need for structure and a mission. He wasn't just their keeper, he was their commanding officer, and they, in turn, were his new fire team. Eris was more than a partner. She was the anchor that kept him grounded in the present, her steady presence a balm on the raw edges of his soul. They worked side by side, their shared mission forging a bond deeper than words. Mr. Peterson was a permanent fixture, a surrogate grandfather to the pack who arrived every Sunday with a truck full of premium dog food and stories about his son, the quiet hero who had started it all. And at the center of it all was Athena. She was no longer the scarred, terrified animal from the tavern. Her coat was thick and glossy, her body strong and healthy. The haunted look was gone, replaced by an intelligent, serene confidence. She was Jake's shadow, his constant companion, the living, breathing embodiment of his redemption. She was the soul he thought he'd lost, given back to him in the form of a loyal friend. On a warm summer afternoon, Jake sat on the porch steps, watching the other dogs play in the newly fenced-in yard. Athena lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot. He reached down and scratched behind her ears, her tail thumping a steady rhythm against the wood. He looked out over his land, his home, his pack. He had found it at last. Not a replacement for what he had lost in the sands of Afghanistan, but something new, a different kind of peace, a different kind of family. He had spent years believing he was the sole survivor, but he was wrong. In the end, they had saved each other.